Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. And well, thank you for joining us on this Thursday morning for the next installation of this eArchiving webinar series. My name is Pavel Stech, and I will be your moderator for today's session. I see people are still connecting, but as we have a full agenda for today, I will quickly go over the housekeeping rules, and then we can go over to the actual presentation. As this is not our very first webinar, I hope that all of these rules are quite ingrained with all of you. And if it is truly your first webinar, welcome, and we will go over the rules just one more time for you guys. First of all, after you have connected your audio, please make sure to keep your audio muted. You are automatically muted upon entry. Please do not try to unmute yourself. There is a chat function, so if you have any questions or comments, please make sure to leave them there and we will get to them. We have a couple of Q&A sessions throughout the webinar, so your questions will not be forgotten. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and published, and none of your personal data will be published alongside the video. We will be posting a satisfaction survey in the chat closer to the end of the webinar, so keep a lookout for that. As your useful comments help us improve our webinars in the future. Next slide. Yes. As you can all see, we have the agenda on screen. My name is Pavel Stech. I am the onboarding manager for eArchiving from the CEF Stakeholder Management Office. And I will do the very brief general welcoming session. Next, we will have Dr. Jamie Kaminsky for the general eArchiving building block welcome. Next, after that, we'll have Anders Bo Nielsen from the Danish National Archives doing relational database archiving using the SIARD format and the SIARD user group. After that, we'll have another speaker, Philip Asving Tummerholt from the Danish National Archives, packaging SIARD in an E-ARK IP, sits for SIARD. And this will lead us to our first Q&A, where we'll have a brief 10-minute question and answer period from everything that you've heard before. And then we'll have a using eArchiving sample software, DBPTK, to export a RDB to SIARD, again by Philip. And this will be a demonstration, and then we'll have a question and answer period for this demonstration and for anything else you have questions for. We have plenty to get through, and I will start. As I said before, my name is Pavel Stech. I'm from the CEF Stakeholder Management Office. Next slide. The eArchiving building block is funded through the Connecting Europe Facility CEF, which is formerly the EU's major financing instrument for trans-European connectivity. This year, the CEF program comes to an end, and there was a conference that I hope many of you had attended a week ago that highlighted the transition of CEF to the Digital Europe program, which is currently being negotiated, but should be ready fairly soon for an official launch. I will quickly go through the governance of the Connecting Europe facility, even though this part may be obsolete any day now. CEF is governed by a regulation, which is then underpinned by a number of guidelines, and then several annual work programs. CEF funds a litany of building blocks that you can see on screen. Next slide. And we do hope that all of them will remain as building blocks, but as stated previously, everything is unknown at this point. We have the big data test infrastructure, which is an environment for experimenting with data sets, open to the public sector for improved performance and decision making. We have the context broker, which is the standard-based API for harnessing real-time data to build smart services and smart solutions. eArchiving will be discussed in this presentation shortly by Dr. Jamie Kaminsky. The European blockchain infrastructure is a blockchain infrastructure at the European level, focusing on specific used cases, such as diplomas and other digitalizations. E-invoicing supports the European standard on e-invoicing, which also supports end-to-end digitalization and procurement. Sorry about that. eID and e-delivery, and also e-signature all help implement the eIDAS regulation, and they deal with the authentication of trust services within the internal market. eID helps support member states with their national eID badges and other means. E-delivery secures payload and content data information along with data exchange. E-signature supports the creation of digital signatures and timestamps and e-seals for interoperable levels. E-translation is a translating tool that can be used online or built into a PC, helping translate into the EU's 24 official languages and other languages, such as Russian, Japanese, and Mandarin. Well, how does Ceph support the use of building blocks? It provides free services to help you implement them in your system. There are a range of services across the building blocks, but services typically include training, sample software, and testing services. Each building blocks has its own service offering, and we can support you directly at a higher level. But there are other commonalities, including, as I said, training sessions and standard software with testing services to check if to see if you are compliant to the standards that are ready at your disposal. We help build and buy or reuse building blocks on your own, as we have many service desks across the other building blocks to help you through any process that you may find difficult. The building blocks do co-develop and partner with other parties, even amongst themselves, and they do have a base for European standards. And that leads me to the one that you are interested in, eArchiving, and I will hand it over to Dr. Jamie Kaminsky.
Thank you, Pavel. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you for that fantastic introduction. As Pavel mentioned, I'm the head of training for the eArchiving building block, and as such, I'd like to welcome you to what is now the 10th of our training webinars. Today we're going to look at relational database archiving using SIARD. Now, what I usually do is say a few words about the background to the eArchiving building block, just to get everybody up to speed. I am mindful of the fact that we do have quite a number of our regular listeners with us today, so as I always do, apologies if you've heard this before, so I will keep it brief for you. So the building block was created in late 2018. Its aim is to provide specifications, software, training, and knowledge to help people preserve and reuse information over the long term. Now, all of this information, it can be found on the building block website. You can see the URL on the screen here, and I'll also provide, after I've spoken, I'll provide the link in the chat box for you as well. So what does the building block do? Well, we provide a variety of eArchiving services. So for example, we maintain technical specifications. In our case, the core specification is the Common Specification for Information Packages, or CSIP. You'll hear a little bit more about this later. But we also provide open source tools that you can download, use straight away. We have compliance and validation services that ensure that the specifications are followed. We have a service desk. We have outreach and community engagement activities, and we're developing a training offering which will be delivered in the form of webinars like this one, video training, and modules on the Moodle platform, amongst others. What we can deliver is very much driven at the moment by the pandemic, so I do not foresee any resumption of face-to-face training this year. So just to give you the heads up on that. So very briefly, I just want to give you a brief overview of some of our forthcoming webinars. The webinars generally run on the second and last Thursdays of the month, starting at 10 in the morning. The next webinar will be about eArchiving Conformance Made Simple. And basically this is about the open source software that the building block has to offer. Now, please note that there's been a date change on this. Previously, this was advertised as the 13th of May. For various technical reasons, we're going to have to give this particular webinar on the 20th of May. So if you booked already, you'll receive a note to this effect. But this is a really interesting webinar. It'll provide a deep technical understanding of the main open source libraries that are available through the eArchiving building block. It's going to be in our sort of new multi-speaker format. So we'll have 4 technical specialists talking about the various software that you can use from the building block software portfolio. So if you're looking for one event where you can learn about the range of software available, then this is it. The following week, so we're obviously condensing webinars this month. So the following week, on the 27th of May, we have putting the 6 content in the CSIP package, and we'll have Karin Bradenberg, one of our regular speakers. She'll be back again to give us an insight into METS, the Metadata Encoding and Transmission Standard, and how it's used to create a package that adheres to CSIP. And this will be followed by a look at the different ways that standards are used to create a SITS. And Karin is one of the architects of CSIP, so it's going to be a really interesting session. And then, as you can see, we've got other sessions on practical applications of digital archiving, the eArchiving reference architecture, validation, and eArchiving geospatial data. So a lot to look forward to in the coming year. Now, as Pavel said earlier, the webinars will be recorded and they'll be made available on the eArchiving webinar page, which you can see a screenshot of here. On this page, you'll have access to the PDF of the slide deck, the recording of the webinar itself, and if you look in the far right-hand column, you'll see a link to the anonymized questions and answers that were asked at the webinar. So if you ask a question today, it'll be transcribed and anonymized and made available for the community. So that's something to note. You can also find our recordings on the CEF Digital YouTube channel, which is a fantastic resource in its own right, because not only does it have the videos from the eArchiving building block, but also the other building blocks that Pavel talked about earlier. So this is well worth a look if you haven't done so already, just to get a flavour of what's out there. So our webinars are part of a broader range of outreach activity. So we try to do workshops when we can and presentations at conferences, obviously somewhat curtailed by the pandemic. But in terms of communications, we've got a LinkedIn group, and you can see the details on screen here. We've also got a Twitter handle, so please sign up for the social media if you haven't done so already. And again, I'll provide these details in the chat box later. So, final slide, you'll be glad to know. Today's webinar, as I said, will explore relational database archiving using SIARD. And we've got 2 speakers today with us from the Danish National Archives. Philip Tommerholt is a digital archivist at the Danish National Archives. He specializes in ingest processes and compliance testing, focusing on databases. And our first speaker for today is Anders Bo Nielsen. Anders Bo is a senior advisor at the Danish National Archives section for digital archives. And he is currently working on requirements for digital archives and the coordination of digital government and digital archives, and specializes in the SIARD format. So, Anders Bo, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So we are going to have first a very brief agenda for those 20 minutes plus, I'm going to speak about relational database archiving and why we need SIARD. So the first part is the explanation about that need, and next we have up is how SIARD is based on open standards, as well as how SIARD has in metadata, and more details about the actual structure of SIARD. Then a bit about the development of the SIARD file format, and following a part about the handling of ISO/SQL, Met, we'll come back to that, which is about large objects, and finally the SIARD 2.2 request for comments that we've had in review and that we're currently working on, and ending with the relational database archiving interest group, a slight change to the previous agenda, but that will leave time for more questions after my colleague Philip has been presenting this part about the packaging of SIARD inside an information package. Now, if we first have a look actually at the need for SIARD, it is so that the relational database is still the rightmost and dominant form of organizing structured digital information. And apart from just the traditional registries and relational databases are now also have been used for decades to manage a huge quantity of documents in the form of digital files. We're speaking about terabyte in size, millions of files. Now, despite having an ISO standard for SQL, the interoperability of these proprietary relational databases, and hereby we are speaking about not the databases as such, but the database management systems, which are the ones handling the databases. Now that interoperability is in fact quite limited, especially over time, and that is a problem that the SIARD format as such addresses. So we have a need here for a persistent data format outside the relational database management systems, and not just one that we can use in the short term, one that we can also have for the long-term archiving. So that's why we need a format like SIARD. Now, moving on into some of the details about SIARD. SIARD stands for Software Independent Archival of Relational Databases. So not just any kind of databases, but relational databases. And directly we have here in the word the part about being independent of software. That is, being independent of the software that used to be running those databases. That's what ensures that you have the option to, when you're basing your preservation on a migration strategy, to actually be able to preserve it and use it in the future. So SIARD is actually a normative description of an open file format for the long-term archiving of relational databases. Note, however, that you can also use it for interoperability at the short term, and is actually also being used for that, but it is designed for the long-term archiving. Now, SIARD is a non-proprietary, published open standard, and on the screen, I hope that you are able to see both the English and the German and the French version of SIARD, as well as one of the things that it's based on, ISO standards Unicode XML. It also uses the URI Internet Standard and SIP, which is our old-fashioned industry standard, but actually these days also is available in an ISO version that you may know, because that's the one that's packaging around all of our modern Office documents, whether we are using the parts from Microsoft or the parts from LibreOffice OpenSource, the open format as such. Now, the aim of employing these internationally recognized standards, that's to ensure the long-term preservation of, and not the least, later on, the access to it. And that, of course, to the databases, those widely used relational databases, and thereby being independent of these proprietary dump formats that you sometimes see from different kinds of database management systems. Now, going further into the SIARD format, we can look at it as such, and it is, as I said, an open file format for archived relational databases. It contains its own metadata describing the document, that is the database, more precisely, in addition to the actual table data. And what is interesting is that SIARD by itself, even in the latest version of it, says that just like you have an XML-based Word, as I said before, or ODS, for that, ODF, for that, ODT, etc., or email, by the way. Just like that, SIARD also has an internal file structure consisting of metadata, primary data, and auxiliary data. And it does so by describing the actual table data. And does that independently, of course, any kind of description in the actual OS package. As you can see here, we actually having SIARD inside a ZIP or a DIP. That's an information package. And that's what's going to be further described by my colleague Phil in the next section. But right now, for this part, we're just focusing on the actual payload, on the actual so-called primary data, which is inside, encircled by the red box here on the screen. Now, further on, we will then look at how the actual structure is. We cannot go into all details, but this is a webinar. We have to at least show you some of the parts about how things are connected using the SIARD. Now, SIARD has a file called the Metadata XML, which actually describes the structure of the database, of the whole database. And it can be somewhat similar to an XML version of the SQL data definition language. And also, of course, has direct relation to where the content is. That is, of course, located in a folder structure, being more efficient and having everything just in an XML format. So as you can see here, I'm not expecting you to actually be able to read everything, understand everything, but to just give you an impression about how the linkage is. Now, moving further on, we then have here a bit about the other elements, because apart from the actual metadata XML, which describes all the database, there's also a schema for the actual tables. And due to the limited space here, we're just seeing a sample for table 0, the base value for table 0. So we start out by the numbering with 0. And further down, we have table 0.xml, which is the actual content. In this case, it's something about the official abbreviations for states of the world. I can say Argentina, Australia, Belgium, and that's how the linkage goes. From the metadata XML, we have the description of the whole database. We have the same information in a more detailed way for the individual tables. And then we have the instance, the table 0 XML, which has the actual content. Not trying to make it even more complex for you, but there's also a schema ruling how you can write these metadata XML files, which actually describe the structure of the database. So you just cannot do it anyway. You have to follow the schema behind it, which is very, very close to the ISO SQL as such. Now, one more step here is to have a look at the development of the SIARD file format, because SIARD has been around for quite some time. It is in, I would say, rather widespread use, users around the world, and it has almost 20 years now behind it, depending on how you look at the different versions. Now, just also to give you a perspective, since we're coming from the Danish National Archives, I can say that around the year 2000, the DNA developed a relational database preservation format based on the EBNF, the extended Archivist form, XML, and SQL. At the same time, the Swiss Federal Archives developed more elaborate format called SIARD. Now, SIARD was developed as part of the Aralda project, which was for archiving of electronic data. And the strategy was really something around 2006. Then in 2008, we saw the first SIARD 1.0 format by the Swiss Federal Archives. And that very same year, it was accepted by the European Open Planners project as the official archiving format for databases. And the SFA, the Swiss Federal Archives, were participants in that project. And that's why we can see here that we have the logos of the Swiss Federal Archives, the Planners project, as well as of the European Union. Now, at the Danish National Archives, we found this format rather interesting. And in 2010, we created a Danish variant called SIARD-DK, which supported large objects, that's files, outside the SIARD file. And we imagine that it will be a few years before a new version of SIARD supporting files outside the actual database will arrive, and then we could give up and retire our own variant SIARD-DK and go back to the common version. Now, that did not quite happen like that, but nevertheless, in 2014 to 17, we had the development of the SIARD 2.0 format by the Swiss Federal Archives in cooperation with the E-ARK project. And the main development, apart from lifting the SQL standard from the previous version to 2008, was the focus on large objects. Following that work, which also resulted in the support of user-defined types, we had the question about the handling of the actual specification. So the business board was created to take care in general of the E-ARK specifications. It stands for the Digital Information Lifecycle Interoperability Standards Board, in which the SFA has, of course, a place. And thereafter, we see then the upcoming version 2.1, mostly to take care of a few minor errors and features that was created solely by the Swiss Federal Archives, as there was no activity there going on at the level of the European Union. Next, again, we have in 2018-19 the E-ARK specifications looking at the tools as part of the E-ARK for All activity in the SIF e-archiving building block. And we had a review of SIARD 2.1, and the small black and white cap up there is because that's when we decided to have also the specifications available on GitHub, work that is still in progress, even though we currently have the specification, this is there, as well as on the filters site, which I'll show you at the end of this presentation, or at least give you the links for it. Now, a result of that review of the SIARD 2.1 and the further discussions in the next activity, the E-ARK tree, was that we said we had to have a further close at the small outstanding issues about scalability. And these scalability issues were mostly regarding the handling of large objects. And that's why we had the SIARD 2.2 request for comments that we had in review, received some comments from many of you, thanks for that. And we are currently working on improving, modifying the review version in order to be able to satisfy as many of the comments that we have received. More about that. Now, large objects, as I spoke about, that is the common name for binary large objects and cache large objects. And that is content such as video, sound, images, word processing documents, etc. CLOP, that's character large objects. Now, these LOPs, they can be stored inside a relational database, and that is being done as blobs or CLOPs, or they can be stored outside as what is called data links. That is what we have in the SQL 2008, the SQL MID, the Management of External Data, MED. Now, binary data in regard to relational databases, that is defined as data in which there is actually no single data type compared to integer or character. And in addition, apart from that problem, the size of the binary data is also quite important due to the need for efficient handling in databases. And binary data, that is, as I said before, mostly referred to as a binary large object. Similarly, you can say that large amounts of character data that's named CLOP, they're also a problem, more due to size than the lack of a proper data type. And in general, you will often therefore deal with CLOPs and blobs in the same way, just calling them LOPs, large objects. Now, databases and their handling of large objects, that has always been a challenge, regardless of whether you actually have the handling based on internal LOPs, which are inside the records of the database, or external LOPs, which are stored as files, mostly outside the relational database and referred to by it, mostly by path, URL, sometimes by ID. Now, as you can see here, it is so that the actual LOP handling, I mean, the first method using internal LOPs, that has been available for many versions of the SQL standard. That's supported by all current relational database management systems. The other method, using external files, that has been available since actually SQL 2003 as the Management of External Data, SQL MED. That's partially supported by the current relational databases management systems, and perhaps due to the lack of details in the SQL standard, those database management systems that do support it partially do it differently. It may also be to make it a bit more difficult to switch to the competitor's product, who knows. Now, the LOP handling here in the SIARD 2.2 format is so that it, of course, is based on the ISO SQL 2008 standard, and it supports the methods we have already for the internal LOPs. What it does in the 2.2 especially is the support for the external files, and it does so by describing, recommending, describing, demanding, some say, in a specific way how you're actually going to handle that part, and thereby make it easier in the future for actually archiving these data. And I must say that it turns out that when one started out using large objects, they were mostly inside the database, and these days they are more and more often outside the database. So we're going to have a closer look at that part. Now, what I'm going to show you now is the work in progress that I spoke about earlier on, being dependent on the comments we received. They are mostly going in the same direction, but sometimes there are comments which are going in different directions, and we're trying to figure out how to accommodate as many of those. Now, having a look at what we have been doing following the comments we received, we have so far proposed something like this, which will be visible in the final version of the SIARD 2.2, which will be, after having been commented, being dealt with at the Delta's board before being finally released on the GitHub. That will not be before the end of this year, most likely. Now, in here, we have tried to describe that we have a database which we have used the name SIARD for as the actual suffix, and the database itself is called Northwind. Now, it is so that up here we're trying to show this part here is actually packaged as a zip file. So what we've seen here is the actual folders and the files down here. That is shown in the very same way that the SIARD specification itself shows it. That's to make it somewhat similar. If you're going to read the SIARD spec later on, my colleague Philip will show you it in a different way using the previous version from the review. Now, down here, of course, we have to figure out how to handle those actual loss, which is most of the problem. And we're doing that by simply saying that you will have problems now and then with handling a certain amount of data. I wanted to say that the actual zip file up here, using its zip64, can handle a huge amount of data. We could actually have terabytes in a single zip file. We do not recommend that, as it seems that many systems, both in the creation of the zip file, creation of the actual SIARD file, and further also the systems which have to package those, have, or at least tend to have, a problem with terabyte large files. So if you have that problem, you may not have it, may have it. We have here the way to do it if you feel forced to segment your large objects and large tables. For example, if you're transmitting data, it's also nice to have a somewhat smaller size for the data that you're transmitting, at a time at least. So in here, we have said that you can then make a segment. This is a folder containing a certain amount of files. The naming is based on the table, column, and row, so that we know where this binary content is actually coming from. This one is coming from table 2, column 4, row 1. Now down here we have, for the illustration, just set that the limit has been reached for how many you can actually handle, and that's the number in one folder. As you may know, certain file systems also have a problem about choking on too many files at a time. This is somewhat similar to what we had in the as an option in the previous version of SIARD. So we are then creating a new folder which contains the other files, as you can see in the example, from the very same table, very same column. But down here, we have then now reached the size of how much we want to have in one folder. This file here, bin, could be imagined, might be a gigabyte size large file, maybe being larger than the threshold that we decided is suitable for our use for this database. And therefore, we are now placing the next binary, the next log from this table at this part here, at the actual folder here called segment 2. So that's how we will further describe it in the SIARD 2.2 request comments based on the comments that we have received from you. Going ahead, and now it gets probably too complex if you're not into SIARD. Now and then, you can see the linking between the different parts. It's coming here. Up here, we have the database. It is having its content, so to speak, the structure of it, described in the usual Metadata.xml file. There's a reference here to the Schema folder. And we then have as well, further down here, the actual content of the table 2 XML. It is something with beverages, soft drinks, and it contains some images. And it is so that we can see that these images have a relation up here because of the location of them. And by having the description here, it makes it possible then to make certain that you can then segment your data. That is done down here, where you can see the segment 0, segment 2. We couldn't show all of the in-between parts, but that's just to make certain that we actually have that part up and running. So I know this might be a bit too complex, but I think you should have at least the chance to just show and be shown some of the parts that are necessary for handling these things. Now, as time is running, we'll move on to the last slide, and that is about something related to this part, namely the lovely cooperation that we have regarding databases. Now, the Database Board and the eArchiving building block, they have initiated a Relational Database Archiving Interest Group that we expect to document and share best practices on database archiving, especially the use of SIARD and the SIARD specifications that we're going to hear about very soon. And of course, also the related software, we're also going to see an example of that. Many of you have already joined. If you want to join, you can still register at this form. And if you want to look further at what's going on, we have these links, both for the content types, which are up next, and also in general about SIARD at the Database Board. Now, I should say this is still a work in progress. So we haven't really done as much as it would look like for this database archiving interest group. And we'll come back to you when we have some more content and some more options about actually participating more directly. So with these promising information, I will then, look at the time, hand it over to my colleague Philip, who will be presenting the next part. So thank you for listening about the actual SIARD, and now we're going to tell you about how SIARD can be packaged in information pack. Over to you, Philip.
Yes, thank you, Anders. My warmest greetings from Denmark to all of you. I hope you would just excuse me for a few seconds while I'm trying to share the slides that I have prepared for you. My name is Philip Tømmerholt, and I have been working for the Danish National Archives the last 8 years. And in all of those years, as Jamie mentioned, I have been working with the preservation of relational databases. In Denmark, we preserve a whole range of data from different systems, and we do it system independently, as it is mentioned in SIARD, and by using this relational database model and SIARD as a vital element. The relational database model is a really strong model for preserving data in the long term, since you, in a simple and logical way, are able to store and fix the meaningful relations between vast amounts of data. And I am going to present a specification today that has a long, and I must admit it, a quite boring name. It is the Content Information Type Specification for Relational Databases using SIARD. We who currently work with the specification just call it SIARD, since it is much easier and faster to say, but it is important to actually read the long title sometimes to understand what the specification is about. The goal for the next 25 minutes or so is that as many of you will understand the central reasons and the purposes behind the specification, and even more importantly, you will know where you can find the specifications and learn more. Because we really don't have the time today for what most solid specification work is also about, which is the nitty-gritty details. I'm glad that Anders Bo found the time to show you some of the detailed work that we are doing, but for this SIARD presentation, I will try to focus on the headlines. And at this slide, you can see some of the questions and headlines that we will go through, and I will just give you a few seconds to read them. The first thing that you shall learn today is that SIARD is a packaging specification. It is as simple as that. You heard Anders Bo earlier describe what the SIARD specification is and what the SIARD specification deals with, and it is the aim that SIARD takes care of all of that which the SIARD specification mentions is out of the scope of the SIARD specification itself. So in this first round, the main objective of the SIARD specification has been to make this specification as simple as possible and make sure to actually package the SIARD file inside an SCSIP. The SIARD is a brand new specification. in the previous work, we have used a lot of energy on the common specification for information packages. And actually, it is a prerequisite that you know this specification, since all the underlying specifications must live up to this common specification. We who work with this specification just call it the CSIP, as Jamie also told you. You must also know of the SIP, the AIP, and the DIP specifications, and you can find earlier webinars who present these specifications, or you can register for the upcoming events as Jamie mentioned. But as you can see, we have now taken the first steps to create content information type specifications. The first draft version of SIARD was sent out on review, which ended this January. And we have received answers that we are currently in the process of implementing, with a deadline in October. And basically, just to say that these content information type specifications, the word content information type is a term that comes from OAIS, and it briefly describes that you have some different kinds of data that could be geodata or data from electronic records management system, or in this case, the relational databases. So we are touching upon a more broad understanding of what a relational database is and how we are packaging by using the SIARD specification and by setting up a set of requirements in the SIARD specification. And another way of understanding the specification landscape is to look at this figure, which is taken from the SIARD specification. All the specification in the specification landscape go from generic to more detailed, but it is actually not the aim of the SIARD to go down to a too detailed level yet. Local implementation and extra rules can still be enforced. If we, for example, look at table and column descriptions, then this is actually optional in the SIARD specification. There's room for providing table and column descriptions, but it's not a mandatory requirement in the SIARD specification itself. But here in the SIARD specification, it is recommended that these should be there in order to ensure long-term preservation and the means to understand the data when we look at the data again in 20 years and have gotten all about the meaning. A local implementation could go even further, as we probably will in Denmark, and make sure that all table and column descriptions must exist. So this is just to state that when understanding the SIARD specification, understanding the SIARD specification, understanding the common IP specification, it is a vital element for us who write the specifications that the decisions on where to actually put the requirement is in the right place, so we as different institutions can make sure to use the correct specifications and set up our own rules if we see the need for it. So it follows one of the principles in the common IP specification, which is that you should be able to put in all data in a package and be able to still harvest the benefits from being able to cooperate on the same specification and using the same tools. When the review answers have been implemented in October in the SIARD specification, you will be able to find the SIARD specification at this link. But if you can't wait, you can look into the draft version, which can be found at the dilsys.eu. Anders Bo briefly mentioned the DILSYS board, and this is a good interest to, in a fast way, actually find the specifications that you are interested in. And there's also here that you can join, if you have not done so already, the user group that we are in the process of setting up. But another place that you can find the SIARD specification is at our GitHub site. And if you do have questions or remarks about the specification, please don't hesitate to create an issue at the site. All activity around the specification is really much welcomed. Speaking of activity, I also urge you to look at the guideline, which is out on review right now. In the guideline, we aim to introduce preservation of relational databases to newcomers to the field, and we also go down to the level of each requirement and describe the purpose and the reasoning behind the requirement. And as I said before, the specification is about the nitty-gritty details. So if at least one of you reads the guideline, see the reasoning behind why we have set up the different requirements and provide feedback, it would be very, very much welcomed. And also, please ask questions during this presentations, because we have a Q&A session coming up. I have prepared a few slides with a run-through of the contents of the specification. And the first thing in the specification, after the description of the specification landscape, is actually a visualization of the folder structure and an example of an information package which holds a SIARD file and holds all the other vital elements for actually understanding the database that has been preserved. You can see that there is an entity relational diagram of the database in the documentation folder. You can see the relevant schemas in the schemas folder, and there's also relating metadata, premise.xml, and, for example, ead.xml, and of course the big metadata file of any common information package, that is the mets.xml. You can also see that this is a database that has external lobs. The lobs are not internal, they're not existing in the raw data, they are handled as external files in the data folder. And as Anders Bo said, the work that is being done right now to implement all the good review answers for the SIARD specification itself, that is being implemented right now. So we will also need to revise this SIARD specification and this example so that it fits with the new requirements. And speaking of examples, at the GitHub repo I mentioned earlier, it is possible to see example packages that live up to the requirements in the SIARD. And we plan to populate the repo with more examples, since our experience tells us that specifications are most easily understood by having good examples. So Aristotle did not live in vain. Finally, I am going to show you how a requirement looks like in SIARD. It follows a structure and a logic that can also be found in the other eArchiving specifications. First, we have an ID, and this is the first requirement of the specification, called SIARD_1. It does not have a name and location information, since this requirement is not a requirement inside a MES file. If you know the CSIP, then you know that METS is a vital file which structures the information in a package, and most of the strict requirements in SIARD are MET requirements. After name and location, there follows a description of the requirement. And finally, there is a cardinality and a Moscow level. And I guess you all know Moscow. If it's a must requirement, it is you must live up to this, and a should is just a strong recommendation, and you can also have coulds and mays. I think that in this SIARD specification, we only operate with must, should, and may. And as I said earlier, if you want to know the reason behind each of the requirements, then I urge you to find the guideline that has been made for SIARD, and you can contact us via GitHub if you have any questions or remarks. The SIARD specification is having requirements in these 6 chapters, as you can see to the left on the screen. The first requirement is the link between the package METs and the representation METs. So the first requirement is that there actually must be minimum one representation where you can find a SIARD file, because it doesn't make sense to actually call it a SIARD package if it does not have relational database data in it. And thereby follows in section 3.3 of the specification all the related requirements to the main package METs that is at the root folder, and then follows a range of requirements that goes to each of the representation METs files. So if you go back to the if I'm able to do that. If you go back to the folder structure, you can see the representation folder. There is just one representation called avid.sa 18005, but there could also exist more representations within this representation folder, and thereby exist different representation METs XML files. So this representation METs file actually describes the content of the single representation, and we have found this really important in the SIARD specification, since it is a normal thing to do at archive. So if you have a SIARD 1 file, and you will have the benefits of actually migrating to the newest SIARD version and having a representation of all the databases in the same form in order to achieve a more efficient dissemination and access scenario, then it is a smart thing in this common information package that you can deal with different representations of the SIARD file. So instead of altering inside the whole information package, you can actually just create a new representation with the newest SIARD version if you want to do that. You can also have a representation where you have the proprietary data dump, the data file that the different relational database management systems actually store. So, so this is why we state, and the SIARD specification is built up, that we operate with having one package METs that only describes the package as at a general level, and then let the different representation METs files describe which version of a relational database is inside this representation. And this, of course, creates some extra requirements in section 3.5, where we make sure that the information and when the package which points to the representation methods, that these information about what kind of versions exist in the representations, they are identical. So this is just a way to enforce integrity in the different representations. And in section 3.6, we have the different versions that exist right now, where you can see that it is possible to store SIARD 1.0, SIARD 2.0, SIARD 2.1, SIARD 2.11, and of course also the SIARD dump value. So we maintain a list within this specification to handle which kinds of SIARD versions we package. But as you have already heard, all of these requirements that I've just described to you now, these are just a way to actually make sure that we can package the SIARD specification within the eArchiving specifications in general. And this was what I prepared for this session. So we have a 10-minute Q&A, and Pavel, would you like to take over?
Yes, thank you so much, Philip, and Anders as well. So we have a 10-minute Q&A session of what you heard in the first part of this webinar. If you do have any questions, please write your questions in the chat. I will read them out, and they will. If you want to direct them to any of our speakers, please make sure to include their names. I'll give you all a minute for you to write your question in the chat. Philip, it seems everything has been clear so far. I don't see any movement in the chat.
Okay, we also have a Q&A
Yes.
at the end. So maybe if people have questions for the SIARD specification itself or the SIARD specification, we can also try to answer them there. But then I think I will go forward with the last session.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. I think you are able to see my share screen now.
Yes, we do.
Thanks. And now we will look into one of the tools that support a wide range of tasks for preserving databases. The software is called DBPTK, and that is an acronym for the Database Preservation Toolkit. The plan for this session is that I'm going to show you some slides that briefly presents some of the functionalities of the Database Preservation Toolkit. I have borrowed some of the pictures from a previous presentation made by Keep Solutions. And if you want a more thorough and professional presentation, you can turn to recordings of the previous webinars, or you can register to the future events, because I know that there are more presentations coming up where there is time for actually looking into the the many functionalities of the software that there is. And I know that the software is under further development right now, so please follow and maybe also take part in this development. And what I think I might add to the community and to this presentation is to present the Danish National Archives experiences with the development and the use of this tool, of this toolkit. The toolkit is developed by Keep Solutions, and it is an open source toolkit. And if you go to databasepreservation.com, you will find more presentations about the toolkit, and you will also find the links for the GitHub repos where the tools are located. But for me and for the world of archives, this picture describes one of the core functionalities of the toolkit. As you might know, there is a large range of different relational database management systems, as Anders Bo told you about, and why we need the SIARD specification, because they all have their proprietary ways of handling data, even though they, to a broad degree, are compliant with the SQL standards. But there are some small deviations, and what this toolkit does is that it can attach itself to a live database and then export the content and the metadata to the SIARD format and the different versions of the SIARD format. As you can see down in the right corner, there are export modules for SIARD 1, for SIARD 2, SIARD 2.1, SIARD 2.11, and there will probably also be for SIARD 2.2 when the new SIARD version will be published. And then there is also the export module to SIARD DK. If you remember what Anders Bo showed you in the line of development of the SIARD specification, we in 2010 developed our own SIARD variant, and this toolkit actually, and since this variant is not that far away from the SIARD specification itself, this toolkit actually supports to export data, metadata, and data from the import modules you can see at the left side to our current preservation format at the Danish National Archives. So this is the situation where we are going out to a submitting institution that has the data on MySQL or Oracle or SQL server, and then this tool can actually support that we migrate this data into our current preservation format. What is also really nice about this functionality is that you can go from a SIARD file and then export it into an existing database, relational database management system. This can be handy when you are trying to access the data and you want to see and work further with the data in your own relational database management system. But actually, the toolkit also, if you're not that familiar with the relational database management systems, then this toolkit also provides a visualization of SIARD files in its own way, so that you don't have to know SQL to actually look at data in the databases that we are preserving. And that I think that is the second good functionality that there is within this toolkit. And the third really nice functionality within this toolkit see from my side is that you can have your old SIARD versions of that you have already preserved in your archival storage, and use this toolkit to migrate and convert it up to the newest version of SIARD 2.2, perhaps in the future. So in order to make sure that we as an archive in an efficient manner all have all the information in the same way, so that we know that we can give access to data if it was just being sent to us last year, or if we're going to present data to the user where this data was created back in the 70s, where we at the Danish National Archives already have data that goes back to actually before the 70s. In the 70s, that was where we started preserving data, and at that time we did not preserve it by using the relational database model. We had another format, but as an archive, we always do our best to make sure that we have the same package structure for all the packages, so we keep our costs of maintaining the data at a minimum. So I think this slide shows three of the main functionalities that this toolkit supports in our work, and I have taken some more slides with me from the toolkit. As you can see, there are three boxes when you open this desktop version of the Database Preservation Toolkit. You can create a SIARD file, and that is by, as I stated earlier, attach yourself to live databases or take SIARD files and create new SIARD files from them. You can also, in the middle box, have the ingest functionality, where you have a SIARD file already and you just ingest it into this tool, which indexes the data in the database for you, which allows you to visualize the data, because that is what you see in the right box called Manage. This is where you can visualize your information inside the SIARD files, and you can also do a lot of other things to the data that will make the data more searchable and more readable. You can, for example, edit the metadata of the file. So if you have a database from a standard system, you can have and populate the tables with extra information describing what kind of data is in the tables of the database. It is also here that you can manage all the different SIARD files. So when you click the Manage button, you will see a wide list of the databases that you have ingested into this tool. And this is, of course, meant to be a tool that you as a user can dig into the preservation data that we have in the SIARD files. This slide is a visualization of all the tables within the SIARD file. It only looks at the metadata that is called the metadata XML and takes all the information from there. The big bubbles you can see is a visualization that tries to inform the user which tables are the most interesting for the user. So the bigger the bubble, the more important we believe, or the tool believe, that this table is. And the algorithm behind this visualization is that the more connections you as a table have, the more foreign keys you receive, the bigger the bubble. That is one of the parameters in this algorithm. The other, some of the other parameters in the algorithm is how many records is actually in the table. So if there is a table with a lot of records and a lot of foreign keys, then it will be the most visible to the user. So it's just an explorative visualization for a user who does not know anything about the archive database. Under the visualization, you can see all the table names that are depicted in the visualization, and if it exists, there will also be a description of the tables. So in the tool, you can actually click at the bubbles and you will go directly to the table. If I click on a payment bubble, I will go to a table, the table called payment in this database, and I will see all the table data with all the payments that are stored in this database. It is possible to drag and drop these bubbles, and it's possible to click on the table names under the picture and go directly to the tables. At the left panel, you can see that the tables are also listed by their names, and this is also a way to navigate the database. So it is this toolkit provides a good means for us to explore the databases and not look at the raw XML as we normally do in when we handle the information packages with the databases. And if we go to the next slide, I have here a slide where a single table is being shown. The table is called film, and this is just a list of movies with a title, a description, release year, length, rating, and so on. So this tool, and by the metadata that we store in the SIARD file, we are able to set up advanced search and let us see which movies were released in 2006 without actually having the expertise of doing these SQL lookups. So this visualization and this explorative way of looking down into the raw XML data is really a nice tool. And you can, as you can see, you can search the different tables, but you can also search for all records inside the database. So when a SIARD file is ingested into this tool, there's a Zoller indexing underneath, which makes it possible for us to make a full search of all the records in a database. I think that is also one of the really great functionalities of this tool. Of course, you're also able to see the tables and the foreign keys and so on, but for the average user of the archive and the average user situation, it is mainly a search all records that I think we are interested in. And of course, if a user of the archive wants to find something specific inside the SIARD files that we preserve, then of course we as archivists will try to find the specific information and not let the user try to find it himself. That is also one of the services that we have. When we look at the Database Preservation Toolkit, I would say that it is important for you to know that it comes in 3 different forms. There is the desktop version, which is the slides that I've shown to you now. It's just a desktop version where the user can dig into the data of the stored databases. But that is, of course, reliant that you can only have a few databases indexed, and it is a single user program, since it is an application. The Database Preservation Toolkit also comes at the enterprise level, where it is possible to have it's possible to browse via a normal browser and search on the content of multiple large preserved databases. So this version of the toolkit is meant for scalability, so that you are able to have a lot of preserved databases, and you also have a lot of different users who will look into the different databases that you have as an institution. And finally, we have the Database Preservation Toolkit Developer, which is a command line tool and a development library. And in the beginning, it was all of these functionalities was actually command line. And there's also via the command line tool that you will gain all the possibilities of going from either the live relational database management system and to a SIARD version, or going from SIARD versions to SIARD versions. As you could see, there were these import and export modules, so it is via the command line tool that you will gain all the functionalities and decide which should be the import module and what should be the export module. Here is a overview of the 3 different forms that the toolkit has and what functionality it supports. And I already mentioned this. I'll just give you a few seconds to look at the table. Yes, and as you can see, the line 3, what I haven't talked about yet is actually that there's also a validation functionality in the toolkit. So if you come with something that states that it is a SIARD file, and it states that it is a special version of the SIARD files, then there is also validation functionality inside this toolkit to see if it is indeed a valid SIARD file, if it does live up to the specification version that the SIARD file states itself to conform with. And another thing I didn't talk about was the activity log. Of course, in the enterprise version, you are also able to log what the users of the toolkit has been looking at and what the users have been doing with the information. This is something that is important for us as an institution, since we have archival records which are sensitive. They have sensitive information in them, so of course it is a necessity to also log which users have been looking at the data in the databases. Here you see where the functionality in the GUI where you are attaching yourself with a connection string to a live relational database. You can see some of the options in the left panel. You can access the Microsoft Access database or Oracle, Postgres, or also. And of course, it's a connection string. Just write the name of the server, the port number, username that you are going to, which has the right privileges. So you make sure that you actually have a connection to the database, and that is the first step when you're using this GUI, is to actually test the connection if you are able to connect to the database. And then if you go further in this GUI, you will have the choices of having lobs inside the database or external lobs, and you also have the opportunity to say which export version that you would like the data to be with. So these were some of the slides and some of the functionalities that I think is important for us as an archive when it comes to the handling of relational databases. And I'm going now to tell you a little more about the way we are using SIARD, SIARD-DK, and the toolkit now, and how we plan to use it in the years to come. And in Denmark, we have the authority by law to collect data from all ministries and all agencies. So that means, for example, all of the health authorities and all of the tax authorities. If they are creating data that we as an archive think is historically important, then we have the authority by law to come to this institution and say, we need to have this data for our archive. And it's not only the ministries and agencies, it is also the military, it is the police, it's the courts, and it's also the regions and municipalities of Denmark. Actually, we also have some extra authority. Before the authorities take in a new system, they have to apply to us as a national archive, and we say if they're allowed to have this system, if they are creating data that is of historical value, because they need to be sure by a current law that the data they create, it can actually be preserved. And by this, it is also our decision which formats and which structures the data has to be converted to. And this is currently SIARD-DK, as we have mentioned a couple of times now. And annually, we receive data from more than 400 systems, and approximately 50 terabytes is ingested into our digital long-term storage. And again, all is based on the relational database model, SIARD, with accompanying lobs. And it is the submitting institution that has to cover the costs of creating the submission information package. And I would say that the numbers tell us that approximately 80% they hire an IT company to do the preservation task for them. They actually do the actual migration job. And 20% of the submitting institutions try to do it themselves. Some of them are really good at it, but sometimes some of these submitting institutions also run into some troubles when performing this task. So what I'm trying to say is that there actually is a market for preserving relational databases in Denmark. And this market is connected to the way the way we state that the preservation of data has to be. So this, of course, gives us a huge responsibility to make sure that this isn't too costly for the submitting institution, and it isn't too hard for the submitting institution, even if they, not even, but not taking into account if they hire an IT company or if they do it themselves. So when we first engaged in the E-ARK project in 2014 to 2017, we engaged in the work of developing the SIARD 2.0 specification, and also we participating in having the SIARD export functionality and the visualization functionalities in the toolkit. And we had this pilot project where we went out and made 4 different exports by using this tool. So some of the submitting institutions that it was already planned that they were going to deliver data to us, we made an agreement with them and say, now we try to come out and visit you with this toolkit in hand, and let's see if we are able to export your data from your system into our system in the SIARD format. And it was a great success. 4 of these went really well. Of course, it was a toolkit that was under development at the time, so we found a lot of bugs in the toolkit, but we also had the resources to actually fix the bugs. So after a process of a few months, we were able to actually use this toolkit, and the 3 of the 4 data providers, they have now that data in our archival storage by using this toolkit. And we are advocating the tool at our website at the Danish National Archives, but bear in mind that we are also very conscious about that there is a market. So when we say that these 80% of the submitting institutions they create, they hire IT company to do the preservation task for them before sending the package to us. Then they of course have their own tools and their own setups for actually doing this task. So this tool is primarily taken up by those 20% that sometimes have difficulties in creating information packages and sending them to us. Estonia, and the Estonian National Archives, they funded development in, I can't remember if it was 2019 or 20, or if it went over these years. So this DBTK is a tool that really supports some of the functionalities that we have, and I think it's interesting for me to actually follow this development. And we were also so privileged to be able to give some of our wishes and some of our experiences with this toolkit to the Estonian, the National Archives of Estonia. So thank you for this. And I know that some development is currently going on now, where perhaps there's an opportunity to visualize blobs inside the visualization toolkit, inside the toolkit. So instead of where you look at the different table data, you see that there are some blobs but as it is now, you can only download these blobs and look at them at your own desktop or whatever you are using to see the files that are inside the database. So right now there's a possibility that we will do some experiments with MIME type detection from some of the existing open source tools that there is there, and also for the selected few MIME times there will be investigated the opportunity to see if the blobs inside located to the database can also be visualized in this toolkit. And the last two bullets I have here is this little man looking into the future. And we are to implement, or we plan to implement, the CSIP specification, the SIARD specification, and the SIARD specification in our national legislation from 2023. And by there, we are hoping to gain all of the benefits from actually participating in this e-archiving building block, benefiting from using the specification, using the joint ventures, the tools that are created, the open source tools, and we hope that we will be able to create this digital market where we gain the benefits of interoperability and share our experience with the wider community. Because I must admit that at the Danish National Archives, we are a really small group of dedicated people who think that something as boring as relational database preservation is very exciting. And it is important for us to actually cooperate and talk with and use the same tools and have the same discussions with more people. And actually eArchiving building block and the former E-ARK project, they have enabled us to do so. So we are actually being more professional and being better at preserving the data. Preserving data is a hard task. It's a task that not many people think of, but I think we have something really good going on here. And I'm just delighted that we reached above 100 people today, where we had the chance to discuss the SIARD specification, the SIARD specification, and our experiences with some of the tools that are around the specifications. We, of course, DB-PTK is only one of the tools that exist in the relational database user group that we are trying to establish. I hope that we will be able to join forces and keep a registry over all of the tools that are somehow touching about the specification work that we are doing in order for us to preserve the historical data that we do at the Danish National Archives. And I think that was my time.
Thank you so much, Philip. And thank you so much to all of our speakers, Anders and Dr. Jamie Kaminsky. As I see a comment, database preservation is exciting and fun, and I do agree. Yes, I see Jamie is posting some links in the chat. The chat is open, so if you do have any questions, please write them. We do have quite a few minutes to answer any of your questions on that you may have regarding this webinar. And we have our first question. Do you have any remarks about archiving NoSQL databases? Philip, Anders?
Well, I can say that the SIARD, of course, is, as the word dictates, based on relational databases. We are considering archiving other types of databases. As we said in the old days, we, of course, received databases which were mostly hierarchical before the relational database was the one taking all the interest and taking all the data. Currently, we're looking, of course, at the so-called no-shot databases. And the problem is that what defines them, well, it mostly just defines them what they are not, that they are not ISO SQL compliant databases. We do have those which are based on RDF, having RDF as a description for it as an option. So that we're looking into. But apart from the lack of standardization and lack of widespread use, there's also the matter of cost. To be able to make an archival version supporting truly the W3C RDF of those kind of databases, we will probably need something similar to the amount of resources that we're spending on SIARD. And as all the essential data so far still in those databases, we are focusing all of our resources towards regional databases. But we are in fact following and trying to look at how we can do archiving of databases which do not follow the regional structure. So they are, so to speak, just another way of being organized. Mostly it's graph databases. And we see RDF as the most obvious way of doing that because it's somewhat standardized by the W3C. So that's where we are at. A matter about how much is in other structures and what's the cost of actually being able to preserve those.
Yes, and if I might add, I showed you some of the slides with the navigation of the specification landscape. And this SIARD focuses solely on relational databases, but it is free to everyone to create new content information type specifications. And if you go to the eArchiving website, you will also find a guideline for creating new content information type specifications. So it's along with this principle that you should actually be able to preserve any kind of data that you have, but it really takes some resources and effort, as Anders Bo mentioned, to sit down and agree on how we are going to do this together.
We have another question. Unfortunately, I don't speak I'm sure that someone could provide I remember Fulgencio did state that there will be answers in almost any European language.
I had a question that only I can see. It was related to me privately, and it goes like this. Have you tried to use another tool, for example, SIARD Suite? And could you compare it with Database Preservation Toolkit? And yes, I have tried the SIARD Suite tool. It is also a great tool that I urge all of you to look into. It's actually been maybe more a year ago or something like I used it last time, but it was a vital tool to use in the pilot that I described to you, because we had to create some SIARD files, and at that time the SIARD Suite was the only tool I knew of that could create SIARD files. So I do have some experience with the SIARD Suite, and I think that you should all know it. And this would be a tool that goes along with the list of tools that are related to the SIARD specification and the SIARD specification.
We have a comment. There are some interoperability issues among the different SIARD tools, so that should be looked into with the goal of all SIARD producing tools should be able to be imported into any other tool. Also, SIARD validator should be wide and relaxed, not strict. And
yes,
we do have.
That was that was a comment, and I think I agree definitely with that. We need to look into where we go from one CS file and export it to another CS file, validate it, and that also let the tools be able to so we can handle the CS files in the different tools. And this is actually a task where we have a specification and we have a validator. So if we have a specification and we have two different validators, this is a normal situation where the different validators, they interpret the specification differently. So we have a great task in front of us to join forces and to make these investigations of how the different validators interpret the CS specification in order to give the right feedback into the CS specification development work, so that these questions, they need to have a more they need to be dealt with. So yeah, I agree with you, Torbjørn. I'm not sure what you mean about this. The SIARD validator should be wide and relaxed and not strict.
And just say that sometimes you definitely need a strict interpretation of specification in order to make certain that you can have your data and use them with different applications. But what Philip says is clear that we have to have the database, relational database, archive user group, look into these matters, and we have to take them back to the business board, and together with the persons, organizations, the business board, the Swissville archives, the Database archives, the storage archives, etc., agree upon how we actually interpret the specification when there are going to be some kind of problems, as there will be with any kind of specification. And that's also why we have the same thing in the E-ARK project, namely trying to figure out how to validate all the parts of our specifications. So that's an ever more important task when you get closer and closer to the actual use of it. So just be aware of that. You're not going to be easy, but we will go there slowly together with those who are working with this area. Yes, that was that question or comment from Torbjørn. I'm not very good at Italian either. I had some lesson on my native speaks fluent Italian. So I think that what was the question was about the use of SIARD in the private sector, whereas we are trying to promote these with the use of SIARD. I know there's a few organizations in the private sector, mostly in the areas of pharmaceuticals and a little bit of finance, have taken up that part, but not to a large extent. That's my knowledge about that part. Philip, do you have any further comments regarding the use of SIARD in the private sector, both for actually creating the SIARD files and for also general archiving with the use of SIARD?
Yes, we had some few discussions with some of the biggest companies in Denmark who were actually interested in the SIARD and the preservation of relational databases. I think it's 2 years way back now, so I'm not sure where they are at. But we also have a lot of private institutions that face the new GDPR laws, and they have some information that they are actually they're not keen to get rid of, since there is a lot of useful information in this, but they have to live up to the GDPR. So in this way, we at the Danish National Archives, we can actually preserve the data for them, since we have also some authority by law there. When this is a whole discussion about GDPR and archival law, but there are some private institutions that are interested in this too.
We truly are a European family. Someone writes in a language, we get instantaneous translations by practically everyone. I don't see any other questions. I'll give it a minute. It does give me a minute to say that we did have a post for the EU survey in the chat. And so I will post it again. Yes, that does. I did just post the satisfaction survey for all of you to fill out. If you guys, if all of you have a couple of seconds, it is a very short survey. It does help us in the end. Also, I would like to thank again Anders, Philip, and Jamie for your wonderful presentations. I am giving you a virtual round of applause. I do not see any more questions. Oh, there's one last question that just popped up. Can you use DBTK to create dips?
Yes, it depends on your definition of a dip. But yes, you can do that. So when I had this slide where you could ingest the SIARD files, then there was also the right box where you could manage the SIARD files. And in this functionality, you actually store the SIARD files as discrimination information packages, and you can alter them. You can edit them and enhance them with descriptions and documents and so on. So in that sense, I would say that the Database Preservation Toolkit is able to create dips.
But naturally, that's part is, of course, not the main focus of the Preservation Toolkit. In that case, it's mostly doing the migration from the long time archival format into the format that is usable for whatever application, which is the one that you want to use right now with your preservation package. And of course, you also expect that you would have to have some kind of further information regarding the dip. But impressively, yes, it can do quite a bit of the work already.
And Boris asked the question, what is the relation between Database Preservation Toolkit and other tools for database access? In your case, Sophia, you are using DBView, and you are right, Boris, we still use Sophia in Denmark, but we are investigating further into the Database Preservation Toolkit, and hopefully we will be able to fund some extra development and actually make this the Database Preservation Tool or any other tool likely to that tool make it our dissemination tool. So we are in the process still. Yes, and Kuda says that in Estonia, it's just not for creating tips, it is a fact of view and access environment. And this, that was also what I was trying to say. It depends on what your definition of creating a dip is. Is it a dip when you're actually engaging in the environment, or is a dip just another package as the AIP or the zip is? Yeah.
But as Phil also said, it's our ambition to try to use as many common tools as possible, especially those which are in open source and which have been supported by the European Commission, but open source, of course, is the general argument as such. That would save resources on everybody's part as we see it. We have nothing against our own tools, but just as we gave up our own specification in order for the SIARD, which we found was better, we will, of course, also give up our own applications if we find that the common ones we are working on will be better. And I guess they will. And naturally, of course, the question is when to make the switch. When should you continue to add resources to your own proprietary, home-created tools compared to adding resources into the common tools? That is something that you have to decide yourself when it's the right time to do that.
Well, we are running out of time. We still have 4 minutes, but I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I guess we will be ending off on that note. Thank you all for participating. We had a very good turnout for this webinar. And so again, I can't keep, thank you so much to our speakers, all of you. You did a fantastic job. And just one little caveat, the next webinar is on the 20th. It has been moved a week later for reasons regarding major holidays in almost every European Union state. So just for your information, the next webinar is on May 20th and not on May the 13th. Thank you all so much for participating, and I hope to see you at the next webinar.